Queen Camilla was preparing for the most important comeback of her royal life. Then Princess Anne stopped it in its tracks. What began as a carefully planned return to public duties collapsed within days, not because of scandal, not because of health, but because of whispers surrounding an old letter belonging to Princess Diana. The timing was impossible to ignore, and the closer people looked, the clearer it became. This was never about a schedule. It was about a promise Anne had never broken. If you enjoy deeply researched royal documentaries like this, don't forget to subscribe. The next chapter may completely change how you see this story. What the public saw was one thing. What was actually happening inside the palace was something else entirely. Queen Camilla had been counting down the days. After months spent stepping back from the heaviest of her public commitments, she was finally ready to reclaim the role she had worked so hard to earn: a full, visible return to royal life. A calendar of engagements built to remind the country exactly why she mattered. Her team had spent weeks on it. Every appearance chosen with care, every detail arranged to project strength, warmth, continuity. This was supposed to be the moment Camilla stepped fully back into the light. Then, without warning, it stopped. Inside Buckingham Palace, a request arrived that nobody had anticipated. It did not come through the usual channels, not through the communications office, not through the private secretaries who normally handled such matters. It came directly from Princess Anne, urgent and unambiguous, addressed to the king's closest aides. Pause everything. Do not proceed with the announcements. Do not release the schedule. Not yet. She offered no explanation, no context, just a line that there was something the family needed to see first, the kind of message that coming from anyone else might have been ignored. Coming from Anne, it wasn't. Within hours, senior aides were trading confused half-conversations in hallways that were usually silent. Nobody wanted to ask the obvious question out loud: what could possibly be significant enough to stop a plan that had already been approved, already scheduled, already promised to the public? The answer came that afternoon. Anne arrived at Clarence House carrying something small enough to fit inside a coat pocket. Those who saw her described her expression as unusually guarded, not angry, not emotional, resolute in a way that unsettled people who thought they knew her well. She asked for a private meeting, no witnesses, no notes. What she carried was an envelope, old, sealed with wax cracked along its edges. The handwriting on the front needed no introduction to anyone who had spent time around the family's archives from the 1990s, sloping deliberate, unmistakably Diana's. Nobody outside that room knew what the letter said, but its presence alone was enough to stop Camilla's comeback cold. The engagements vanished from the schedule. The press release, already drafted, already approved, never reached an editor's desk. Camilla was told only that the timing needed to be reconsidered. No explanation followed. Not that day, not for several days after. That was what made it unsettling. Camilla's comeback had been built deliberately, a moment engineered to signal renewal after a period of retreat, the kind of narrative a communications team spends months constructing. And just as it was ready to be unveiled, it had been stopped by the one royal least inclined toward interference of any kind. Whispers began that this was no coincidence, that whatever sat inside that envelope had been waiting years for exactly this moment, that Anne hadn't acted on impulse, she never did, but with the patience of someone who had been holding something back for a very long time. By evening, the mood at Clarence House had turned entirely. A week built around anticipation had become a week defined by one unexplained pause, one sealed envelope, one decision made by a woman who almost never inserted herself into anything like this. Camilla's team scrambled, reschedule, wait, don't ask why, uncertain of anything except that the ground beneath the comeback had shifted. Somewhere in the palace, that envelope sat on a desk, its contents known to exactly 2 people, contents about to determine far more than the timing of one royal return. But none of them yet understood how this had really begun. The news didn't travel through any official channel. It moved the way royal news always does, through late-night phone calls, careful phrasing conversations conducted as though someone might repeat them later. Camilla's first reaction, according to those who spoke with her, was confusion, then something closer to hurt. She had spent months rebuilding her public presence, accepting the quieter period with the kind of patience the role demanded. And now, just as she was ready to step forward again, the obstacle in her path wasn't her health, wasn't the press, it was family. She asked more than once what exactly Anne believed she had done wrong. Nobody could answer her. Nobody outside that private room actually knew. Charles found himself trapped between 3 versions of himself, as king expected to project stability above all. As a husband unable to ignore that his wife had been blindsided in a way that felt to those around her almost cruel in its timing. As a brother aware that Anne did not act like this, not once in more than 50 years of public life had she inserted herself into anything this personal, this potentially damaging. He went quiet. He didn't summon his sister, he didn't demand answers. He waited the way a man waits when some part of him already suspects what's coming and isn't ready to meet it yet. William said nothing. Not to aides, not in family discussions, not to anyone willing to repeat it afterward. Some read the silence as simple discretion, a prince staying out of a dispute between his father, his stepmother, and his aunt. Others read it differently. William, more than anyone left in that family, understood exactly what kind of letter could carry enough weight to stop a royal announcement dead. Catherine kept her distance. Her relationship with Camilla had never been without its quiet friction. Nothing that made headlines, but noticed all the same by people inside the household. She stayed out of it publicly. Privately, those close to her said she was watching more closely than she let on. Meanwhile, the practical fallout landed on the staff. Engagements rescheduled without drawing attention. Journalists told delicately that timelines had shifted. Statements crafted to say nothing while sounding like they said something. Underneath it all sat the harder thing to manage, a family built around presenting a united front, quietly coming apart at the seams. Camilla sidelined, Charles caught in the middle, William guarded, Catherine watching from a careful distance, and Anne, the one person who had set it all in motion, offering no one an explanation. She simply waited, as though she already knew that once the truth surfaced, no one would need to ask her why. But none of them yet understood how this had really begun. Weeks earlier, long before that sealed envelope ever reached Clarence's house, Princess Anne had spent a quiet afternoon at Gatcombe Park doing something she rarely gave herself time for, sorting through old family papers boxes she had never fully catalogued. It suited her. Anne had always been the one who preserved rather than discarded, more comfortable with order than sentiment. She worked through the boxes methodically. No ceremony, just another task to finish. Among the old correspondence and estate records, something stopped her. An envelope slightly yellowed, sealed with wax cracked by age. She recognized the handwriting before she'd even finished lifting it from the box, the way you recognize a voice after decades of silence. A letter from Princess Diana, written during a period Anne remembered in fragments, the mid-90s, when the family sat under enormous pressure, when every relationship inside the household seemed to be shifting beneath the weight of public scrutiny. She read it alone, no one else in the room. It wasn't a simple personal reflection. Diana had written about something she clearly felt strongly enough to put in ink, a fear about how her place in the family's story might one day be handled, how her memory might be shaped, softened, managed by an institution that would outlive her. Nobody but Anne knew the specifics, not in those first days, but those close to her noticed something shift in her afterward. She grew more guarded in conversation. She started asking quiet questions about upcoming palace plans, particularly anything involving Camilla's return to public life. Watching, measuring the timing of everything against something only she understood. It wasn't until Camilla's comeback plans began moving in earnest that Anne's behavior started to make sense to anyone paying close attention. The scale of the engagements, the way the narrative was being shaped. Something about it troubled her, though she said nothing publicly. She reviewed internal briefing documents with unusual care, asked pointed questions about how certain past moments might be referenced during Camilla's reintroduction. It wasn't Camilla she seemed focused on, it was how the palace intended to frame the years surrounding Diana's life, years Anne remembered with a clarity that had never quite faded. Whatever that letter said, it convinced her that an old promise needed honoring, decades late or not. As Camilla's return moved closer to becoming official, Anne made a decision that surprised everyone who thought they understood her, disciplined, protocol-bound, allergic to family drama. She decided to intervene, not publicly, not dramatically, directly in the one way she knew would actually stop the process before it became irreversible. It was never hostility toward Camilla. Those who spoke with her afterward were clear on that point. The concern sat somewhere else entirely, in a private commitment Anne had carried unspoken for nearly 3 decades. What exactly that promise entailed and why it connected so directly to Camilla's comeback stayed locked inside a single letter. A letter Anne had now decided the rest of the family needed to face. But what happened afterward changed everything. The meeting between Anne and Charles took place at Clarence's house in a private study, away from staff, away from cameras. Anne had requested it herself. She arrived by every account with a composure that unsettled her brother more than anger ever could have. She set the envelope on the desk between them, said nothing at first, let the moment sit. Charles reportedly recognized the handwriting the instant he saw it. Some things don't fade even after decades. What followed wasn't a confrontation in the usual sense. No raised voices, no accusations thrown across the room. Those close to the family later described it as quieter than that and far more unsettling for it. Anne explained calmly what she had found among her late mother's records and what the letter revealed about a fear Diana had carried in her final years. Diana had written about a growing unease that as the institution moved forward, without her, her place in her son's story might be minimized, softened, rewritten into something more convenient. She never named names, she never accused anyone directly. She simply asked in her own words that someone make sure her memory wasn't quietly pushed aside. Anne told Charles she had made a private promise after Diana's death, one she had never spoken about, not publicly, not even within the family, to protect that memory, however quietly, for as long as she was able. Now, with Camilla's carefully built comeback approaching, Anne had grown concerned about how the surrounding narrative was taking shape. It was never about Camilla's right to reclaim her role. It was the framing the way certain retrospectives, certain planned appearances seemed to glide past the more painful chapters of the past. A version of royal history that felt to Anne uncomfortably convenient. Charles listened without interrupting. He didn't dismiss her. He also didn't agree to halt anything, not yet. He asked to read the letter in full. Anne let him, watched his expression as his eyes moved across words he likely never expected to see again. Whatever he read in that letter reached him. Those who saw him afterward described someone unusually withdrawn, more contemplative than frustrated. He didn't defend Camilla's team's plans outright. He didn't fully side with his sister either. He asked for time. Time to think. Time to figure out how to move forward without doing more damage to something that had already grown complicated. Before leaving, Anne made her position clear. She wasn't demanding the comeback be cancelled. She wanted assurance that whatever narrative accompanied it wouldn't come at the cost of a mother's memory that had, in her view, already been diminished too many times. It put Charles in an impossible spot. As king, he couldn't be seen bending to family pressure at his wife's expense. As a father, as a brother, he couldn't ignore a warning delivered in his first wife's own handwriting, carried to him by the one sibling who never involved herself in anything like this. The letter stayed on his desk, long after Anne had gone. Staff near his private office noticed him return to it more than once over the following days, reading certain lines again as though searching for something he'd missed the first time. No resolution that afternoon, no final decision. But something had shifted, and it wasn't shifting back. A comeback that once looked like a straightforward reassertion of Camilla's public role was now tangled up with a decades-old promise, a fear Diana had quietly written down, and a king forced to weigh institutional loyalty against personal conscience. Yet the document waiting on Charles's desk told a very different story. Within days, a private family matter became a palace matter. Charles brought it to his most senior advisors, private secretaries, communications strategists, the small circle whose entire job is protecting the institution above any one person's preferences. Their reaction was measured and urgent. Nobody wanted to be seen dismissing Anne's concerns outright, not with anything connected to Diana's memory. At the same time, nobody wanted to be responsible for indefinitely stalling a comeback that had already been built, funded, and half promised to a waiting public. The conversations that followed weren't tense because of raised voices. They were tense because of calculated risk. How much of Anne's concern needed direct acknowledgement? How much could be managed quietly through small adjustments to language and timing? One faction argued for transparency, acknowledging in some careful form that the past required sensitivity without ever naming the letter or Anne directly. Another pushed for caution, postponed the whole thing until the family reached private consensus, whatever that cost in uncertainty. It stopped being a scheduling question almost overnight. It became a question of how the institution intended to handle its own history, how much of the past it was willing to face honestly, and how much it preferred buried. Archival specialists were quietly brought in, tasked with reviewing old statements and records connected to the years surrounding Diana's death, hunting for anything that might resurface under closer scrutiny. The real fear was never that this one letter would leak. It was what else might still be sitting in a family archive somewhere, waiting for its own moment. Camilla was told only the broad strokes of family matter, requiring careful handling. Nothing about what Anne had found, nothing about what Diana had written. Her frustration deepened with each day that passed without an answer. Meanwhile, the machinery of image management ground quietly on, statements rewritten, talking points revised, media contacts managed, told only that adjustments were coming for reasons that had nothing to do with her. Anne stayed out of the institutional back and forth entirely. She had said what she needed to say to the one person who could act on it. She let the process unfold, trusting the weight of what she'd shown Charles to do the rest. But inside the palace walls, a quiet recalibration was already underway, one that wouldn't stay hidden from the outside world for long, however carefully it was managed. The machinery had already begun moving. It started small. A scheduled announcement meant to launch Camilla's return to a full public calendar quietly slipped by a week. Palace communications offered nothing beyond a vague line about scheduling adjustments. Then the changes grew harder to miss. Engagements once positioned as the centerpiece of her comeback were scaled down. One high-profile appearance quietly swapped for something smaller, something less watched. Journalists who'd been briefed early noticed the shift immediately, even without a word of confirmation from the palace. Staff rewrote plans that had taken weeks to finalize. Meetings that had once focused on maximizing visibility now focused on damage control, how to make these changes look ordinary. The language shifted too. Draft press materials lost the phrasing that once framed Camilla's return as a definitive celebratory reassertion. In its place, softer wording, no grand declarations, a gradual ongoing process instead of a triumphant one. Some inside the household read it as a quiet attempt to honor Anne's concerns without ever naming them. Soften the tone, avoid the appearance of erasing the past, still let Camilla resume her duties just without the fanfare originally planned. Camilla learned of each adjustment gradually, each one another small reminder that months of planning were being reshaped by forces she couldn't see and didn't control. Those around her noticed her growing more aware by the day that something significant had happened behind a closed door she hadn't been let into. Royal correspondents started noticing the pattern. 2 quiet delays, scaled-back plans, careful rewrites, the kind of pattern long-time palace watchers had seen before, back when internal tension had spilled into official planning, without ever being confirmed outright. Even the venues changed. Locations chosen for their symbolic weight quietly swapped for something with less history attached. Themes built around renewal and resilience softened into something simpler, ongoing charitable work, nothing more. To those who understood the full picture, every one of these small adjustments was the visible edge of a private tension still unresolved between Anne Charles and Camilla. To the public, it looked like nothing. Minor scheduling noise easily lost in the churn of royal news. Inside the household, though, everyone understood the comeback hadn't been cancelled. It had been reshaped, softened, delayed just enough to avoid open confrontation without ever actually resolving what had triggered it. And one meeting stayed missing from the calendar. The final conversation between the 2 women at the center of it all. Everyone around them could feel it coming. But one final meeting still remained. It finally happened at Gatcombe Park. No staff, no agenda, no aides taking notes in the next room. Exactly the kind of conversation Anne preferred, direct, private, stripped of the performative caution that usually governs royal exchanges. Camilla arrived uncertain what to expect. Weeks of watching her comeback, quietly reshaped without explanation, had left her braced for a fight. She walked in ready to defend herself, ready to ask directly why she'd been made to feel like an obstacle in her own return. Anne didn't open with a confrontation. She started by acknowledging how difficult the past weeks must have been, Camilla caught in the middle of something she hadn't created and couldn't influence. Not quite an apology. An attempt at honesty at least, an acknowledgement that Camilla was never really the target. Then the letter. Anne described in general terms what she'd found among the old family papers and the promise she'd carried quietly since Diana's death. This was never about questioning Camilla's right to her role. It was about making sure the story around her comeback didn't even by accident minimize a memory Anne had sworn to protect. Camilla listened without interrupting. When she finally spoke, sadness carried more weight than anger. She understood, she said, the delicate position she occupied, always aware of how her own presence might be read against the memory of the woman who came before her. She had never wanted her return to come at anyone else's expense. If the framing around it had ever suggested otherwise, that was never her intention. No full resolution came out of that room. Anne didn't walk back her concerns. Camilla got no guarantee her original plans would return in full. What emerged instead was quieter than agreement, a mutual understanding built on honesty rather than consensus. Anne left with her position unmoved. The past deserved careful, respectful framing. Camilla left with a clearer picture of why her comeback had changed, even though the practical outcome stayed the same. Neither woman won, neither claimed vindication. What did shift was something harder to measure. The tension of the previous weeks softened into something closer to cautious respect. Camilla privately expressed something like gratitude that Anne had chosen honesty over a public standoff, sparing her the far worse alternative of a family rift playing out in headlines. Anne in turn reportedly told a close confidant that hurting Camilla had never been the point, only keeping a promise made decades earlier from quietly slipping away. The institutional decisions stayed exactly as they were. Softened messaging, scaled-back engagements, a more careful tone, none of it reversed. But something had changed anyway, something that didn't show up on a public schedule. Those closest to the family called it a shift from confrontation to coexistence, not a fix for what had already happened, but enough to keep it from becoming something worse. Only later would the rest of the family discover what had really been said. It didn't take long. Delays, scaled-back plans, carefully rewritten statements. Royal correspondents, well practiced in reading between palace lines, began stitching together their own version of events, no official confirmation required. The first major report came from a well-connected royal columnist, noting the sudden softening of language around Camilla's return and speculating openly about internal disagreement. The piece stopped short of naming Anne. It didn't need to. Tension among senior royals did the work instead. Once it published, the story moved fast. Other outlets built on it. Some pointed to downplayed health concerns, others to internal disputes over public relations strategy. A smaller group, the ones who actually understood how rarely Anne intervened in anything, suggested something more personal, more historically rooted. Social media did the rest. Clips of Camilla's newly subdued appearances got placed beside the grander plans leaked months earlier. Was the palace managing her image downward on purpose? And if so, why? Public opinion split fast and predictably. Some defended Camilla outright. She'd earned a full, confident return, and any family interference was unfair to her. Others sided with what they believed Anne represented, a quiet guardian standing watch over Diana's memory, unwilling to let the past get smoothed over for anyone's convenience. Royal historians turned up on television, drawing comparisons to earlier moments when family tension had shaped public royal decisions without ever being officially acknowledged. Panels debated the ethics of it, managing a queen consort's image around a predecessor's memory. Necessary sensitivity, some argued, an unfair burden, others countered. International outlets picked it up too, folding it into a bigger conversation about how modern monarchies balance evolving roles against complicated inheritances. Inside the palace, communications staff were stuck. Confirming or denying either one risked feeding the story further, so they said almost nothing, reaffirming in the vaguest terms possible general support for Camilla's charitable work. Camilla found the speculation genuinely uncomfortable. None of it, the memory, the legacy, the comparisons, was ever what she'd set out to invite. She hadn't tried to diminish anyone, and yet here she was, her comeback tangled in a public argument about fairness and inheritance she'd never asked to be part of. Anne said nothing at all, not one public comment. She kept her own schedule running untouched by the noise, letting the story build without her. What had started as the private disagreement had become something bigger, a public referendum on how the modern monarchy handles its most delicate inheritance, the memory of Diana and the space it still occupies in decisions made decades after her death. The public had chosen a side, but the family still had to face each other. It arrived not as a statement, but as an appearance. A formal royal engagement locked in months ahead, impossible to cancel, without inviting even more attention, the first time Anne and Camilla stood together in public since Gatcombe Park. Every detail got studied afterward with the kind of intensity usually reserved for far bigger royal occasions. The order they arrived in, the distance between them in the receiving line. A brief exchange of words caught on camera, audio too faint to make out. Neither woman avoided the other, outright read by many as proof no lasting rupture had occurred. But neither showed the easy familiarity of their earlier joint appearances that year either. A subtle shift, the kind seasoned royal watchers notice instantly and everyone else catches up to a day later. At one point, the two stood side by side for a formal photograph. Commentators picked the image apart for days, the placement of their hands, the angle of their shoulders, a glance exchanged a half-second before the shutter clicked. Camilla looked composed throughout, warm, with attendees professional as ever. But those watching closely noticed the restraint underneath it, a quieter version of the confident return she'd originally planned to make. Anne moved through the event with her usual efficiency, brief, polite exchanges, no gesture that read as either reconciliation or lingering tension, the same disciplined neutrality she'd shown the entire time. The press walked away with no clean answer, only fragments to argue over. Some called the interaction proof the family had moved past it. Others read the same restraint as unresolved tension simmering just under a carefully held public front. One thing was clear to almost everyone watching: the grand celebratory comeback once planned for Camilla had permanently become something else. Quieter, more measured, a demonstration of stability rather than the triumphant return once promised. For those who knew the full story, the symbolism ran deeper. This wasn't two women posing for cameras. It was the visible outcome of a private letter, a decades-old promise, and a family forced to walk the narrow space between honoring the past and still moving forward. As the event ended and the two women left separately, no lingering interaction beyond basic courtesy, those watching were left with the image that would come to define this whole chapter of royal history. Not a confrontation, a distance, careful, deliberate, and shared by two women bound together by a memory neither of them could fully set down. In the weeks that followed, palace life settled into a new rhythm, quieter than before. Camilla's public role continued. It never fully became the ambitious comeback once envisioned. Her engagement stayed steady, respected, consistent. But the grand narrative that had once surrounded her return had given way permanently to something more restrained. The experience left its mark on her. Those close to her noticed a shift, more attentive to the weight certain moments carried, more conscious of how her presence might land against the family's harder chapters. She didn't withdraw, she didn't voice resentment toward Anne. She simply absorbed the lesson and moved forward, never once acknowledging out loud why. Charles stayed private about the whole episode. He never addressed the letter publicly. Never the delays. Never the speculation that briefly consumed royal commentary. But those closest to him noticed something new in how he approached decisions touching the family's history: more caution, more consultation, less willingness to let anything involving Diana's legacy move forward without real thought behind it. William's silence held even after the story faded from the headlines. He never commented on what passed between his aunt and his stepmother, holding the same careful neutrality from start to finish. But those who knew him well believed the episode confirmed something he'd understood privately for years: that his mother's memory remained a quiet, powerful force inside that family, capable of shaping decisions decades after her death, even absent, even silent. Catherine, who'd kept her distance the whole way through, reportedly grew a little closer to Camilla in the aftermath, an unexpected solidarity born out of navigating the same complicated family current. Their relationship never lost its underlying tension entirely, but it softened, just enough. And Anne, true to form, never spoke about any of it publicly. No recognition sought, no confirmation of what the letter actually said. She went back to her usual demanding schedule, the same disciplined presence she'd carried her whole royal life. For those who understood what she'd quietly done, the silence afterward fit perfectly. A promise kept not through declaration, but through decades of simply not letting go. The letter itself never surfaced publicly. As far as anyone outside that small circle knew, it went back into hiding, its contents known only to the handful of people who'd read it during those tense weeks. Whether it would ever resurface or whether some future generation of the family might find it themselves, one day stayed an open question nobody involved seemed eager to answer. What the whole episode revealed in the end wasn't a story of winners and losers. It was a quiet demonstration of how much the past still shapes the present inside a modern monarchy. Diana, gone for decades, remained a presence capable of altering the course of royal decisions, her memory guarded in her own quiet way by the one family member who had promised all those years ago never to let it be forgotten. Camilla's comeback, more subdued than planned, still succeeded on its own terms, defined not by grand declarations, but by quiet persistence. Anne's intervention, never publicly explained, accomplished exactly what she'd intended, not the erasure of Camilla's place in the family, but the preservation of a promise carried in silence for nearly 30 years. And somewhere inside Gatcombe Park, an old envelope, its wax seal long since broken, went back into the drawer where it had waited for decades. Its purpose fulfilled, its message delivered. A quiet reminder that even after all this time, some promises are never truly forgotten.